You tell me whenever to start, Norm.
Go ahead.
All right. Okay, it's not advancing for me. There we go. Okay, we begin first with the definition of marriage from Genesis 2:24. Let's read it out together in unison. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Now there's three parts to this. Pastor Dave mentioned this last week. The leaving, the cleaving, and the one flesh. What's involved in leaving? Man will leave his father and mother. What's involved in that with marriage?
Emotion, because nobody likes their...
Pardon, Don?
Emotion, nobody likes their kids to leave.
Yeah, okay. The emotion, yeah, the kids leave.
And the kids lose their security
Yes.
to a certain extent.
What is the primary responsibility now for the man as opposed before? His primary responsibility prior to that is to his own family of origin. But once he gets married, his primary responsibility is now this new family. Now, in our culture, you have leaving being a very physical thing. But in many cultures, and of course the culture of the Bible, did that necessarily involve that? You know, think of the old farms in our own culture. Who worked the farm? The man did, and his wife, and what did the son do?
The 6 or 7 boys, they all helped.
They all helped. When they got married, did they leave? No.
They still helped on the farm.
My grandmother from Baltimore, she and every one of her 5 siblings all lived married for a while with her parents. Because economic reality. The idea of being able to get your own place right away when you get married is a relatively new phenomenon. Many, many families, and it's true cultures around the world, you have to spend some of that time with your parents because you have to build up what you need. For instance, you take marriage at the time of Jesus. What age were the women like Mary when they got married?
Early teens or...
Yeah, why so young? Why so young?
And their parents didn't have to care for them.
Partially, but
Well, they might only make it to 40 or 50, so
yeah.
they started.
Would you like to have a wife with teeth? Dean's not here, but you know, in that culture, probably by the time a woman's in her late 30s, she's lost a lot of her teeth. So, but on the other hand, the husbands like Joseph, what were they age-wise? Maybe, you know, late 20s. I mean, they were established because you didn't want your daughter to marry somebody who was not established. So you had that. But even then, he would still probably be living with his parents. For instance, when Jesus says, in my Father's house, the mistranslation for the King James are many mansions. The idea that when we go to heaven, it's like the game of life and you live in this mansion. That's totally wrong. In my Father's house, there are many rooms. Because what did you do in the village like Nazareth? If you're going to get married, you built a room added on to your dad's house. That's where you and your wife were going to be. And for Jesus to make that statement, in my Father's house there are many rooms, is like Jesus is proposing. He's giving them the ring, he's giving them the hope chest. Because that's what you did. If you're going to marry somebody, you build a room, an addition onto your dad's house. So you didn't have that, but still the understanding is deeply and emotionally like Don said, that it's no longer your primary family. Cleaving, what does cleaving mean? Is there any other you cleave? If you cleave, is there others, or is it just temporary? What does that mean, to cleave? This is permanent.
A whole new attachment.
You're permanently, you're in it. And then one flesh. And what's that a reference to? That is a reference to the sexual act. What they used to call the consummation of the marriage. And that was really important culturally in a lot of places, because unless the marriage was consummated, it really wasn't a marriage. So, those are the three elements involved. Notice what's not involved. Well, we see that in the beginning of marriage, that as explained in Genesis 2, the wife is provided as a helpmeet. Now, we might see that as saying that she's in service to the husband, she's his servant, but that's not the real emphasis there, because that word helpmeet, which is the word ezer, 90% of the time in the Bible is used to refer to God. So it's not the emphasis on her serving, being subservient, but the emphasis on only she can do it. Only she can fulfill that need. Only she has what it takes to complete a man. So it's not so much subservience as it is capability. All right? Now, adultery is understood as voluntary sexual intercourse between a married person and a person who is not his or her spouse. I like the German word for it, like the German, the sixth commandment in German is "Du sollst nicht Ehebrechen." Ehebrechen means to break up the marriage, which is a good way of relating what that means, because when you commit adultery, what are you doing? You're breaking up the marriage. You're splitting it up. You are putting a dagger into it. And that's what's condemned so harshly in the Old Testament. First of all, with the sixth commandment, you shall not commit adultery. Again, German, "Du sollst nicht Ehebrechen." Leviticus 20, somebody read here. Elaborate more.
If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress are to be put to death.
Very strict. But the allowance was made for polygamy, that a man could be freed from adultery if he was doing, who was he having sex with? It had to be somebody who was not married to somebody else. So he could end up having more than one wife. Why was this allowed, though?
Is that society, or is there something in the Bible about that?
Well, did originally, is that God's intent? Is that what we see in the Genesis 2? No. Go ahead, Don.
Maybe it's because women always want to fight, so there's a shortage of men.
Yes. What was the situation culturally for women?
Well, maybe not so much that even, but a woman's husband, like you said, from fighting, died, and now I'm the brother, but I'm married. What do you do? Well, maybe somehow they just started.
Yes, in fact, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the command was given for what's called the Levirate marriage, which Jesus uses when he's dealing with them asking, are we going to be married in heaven? And the people asking him this question aren't really worried about marriage. They are Sadducees who don't believe in the resurrection. And Jesus tells them, well, there's this man, he has 6 brothers, and he marries a woman, dies. The next brother takes her, and all around the list until she has had all 7 brothers as her husband and no children. He said, in the resurrection, whose husband will she be? And they can't answer. And Jesus said, don't you know, there is no marriage we'll be like the angels in heaven. So, but polygamy was allowed Don's nailed it. It's because women, culturally, couldn't support themselves. They needed a man, they needed a male relative to provide for them. And especially if a woman was still at a marriageable age, this allowed for her to be protected like that. And this is a way to ensure that she was taken care of. But this is not what God intended, but it's still what was done. Now, in the Christian church, what was done instead? In the Christian church, one spouse. But what was done to deal with the problem of these women? What was a big mission effort of the early Christian church? Orphans and widows, exactly. They took care of the widows. So they took care of them within their community. And you have the situation where you have Peter saying that, if the woman does have an opportunity to get married again, that's good, but if not, especially those who are older, let's make sure as a community we take care of them. And a lot of early Christians were widows who were provided for by them. So the church as a whole took care of that. In the pagan cultures, you have a lot of adultery protection, but that has nothing to do with so much the moral thing as it was to protect the man's line in the descent and his ownership of his wife. It was more of a legal thing than a moral thing. And why was the man's line so important? Why would the man's line have been so important? How many of us know our family lines? How far back can we trace the names of our ancestors? Can you go to the 5th generation? You can. That's awesome. That's awesome. You're one of the few I know.
10.
Wow. That
But
is, yeah, but that's still extremely rare.
My daughter wants to know, and I can't even number.
Emmanuel, in your country, do people know their family lines further back?
Not so far.
Yeah. Do they know a far back or just a little?
Just a little.
Just a little, okay. But traditionally, especially in the Old Testament, you knew your ancestry line way, way, way back. Why? Because the understanding is that's how you lived in the future. That's why it was so important to hold on to your property, because the property is where your ancestors' graves were. And that's why it was so radical when Abraham left his home, he was leaving that behind. So, especially in the pagan cultures, this was done because this is how you maintain yourself. And of course, often in pagan cultures, how did you view your ancestors? In the Far East, for instance, how did they view their ancestors?
Very highly, almost to the point of worship.
So we say, they worship you. And this is how they maintain. They don't have the concept that we have of resurrection, eternal life in heaven. So you had a lot of emphasis that way. But it was not to care for the woman or to care for the marriage. It was so this man could have his things taken care of. So adultery is really nailed down on. But what if neither of the people involved are married? Well, premarital sex, as we think of it, did not exist in the Old Testament. If neither is married at the time of intercourse, then they are by that act. It's either marriage or adultery. There is no in between. Well, you would say, well, they're not married yet. Well, what makes them married? Well, in our culture, you have this wedding thing. Was there a wedding back in Genesis 2? Was there signing of a license? Was there a pastor or justice of the peace needed to be there to do it? No. All those things are cultural that have been added later. The actual understanding of the Old Testament of the marriage was the sexual act. And so, if a couple was caught, they didn't make a big deal of it. They're married, no big deal. If one of them was married or maybe even later engaged, then it was a huge deal. You know, think of that with Mary and Joseph. Exodus 22, so I'm going to read there.
If a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride the price, and she shall be his wife.
No big deal. Even to the extent of this situation behind that. Well, what lies behind this understanding? What's behind this? Well, what lies behind this is the understanding that the sexual union is to be marriage. It's the one flesh idea. To the point where you have this situation in 2 Samuel, where you have the oldest son of David, Amnon, who lusts for his half-sister Tamar. Tamar's full brother is the guy named Absalom that we learn of later on. And Tamar wants to seduce her, and then he forces himself on her, and after that, he wants to send her away. She's no longer attractive to him. And the girl says, "No, my brother," Tamar said to Absalom, "don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing." She is not so much worried about herself and how she'll be taken advantage of, but rather that this will be done outside of marriage. So she says, "What about me? Where could I get rid of my disgrace? And what about you? You will be like other wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king, David. He will not keep me from being married to you." But he refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than her, he raped her. Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her all more than he loved her. Amnon said to her, "Get up and get out." "No," she said, "sending me would be a greater wrong than what you have already done to me." So why does she plead that he talk to their father? She feels that if he wants her so much, what should happen? They should get married. Then there's no shame. Okay, that's fine. But he doesn't want that. He just wants his own needs met. And in his selfish way, not only rapes her, but afterwards what he thought was attracting her was gone. So what happens to this girl because of this incident? What can she not do? She can't what? She can't get married. Because she is his. And any other relationship she would have as long as he's alive is what? Adultery.
A lot of women identify themselves as being married, like Solomon had 700 wives. Now we have a ring on the finger that indicates that. But how back in those days did men know that this gal was married?
Okay, if you're talking about royalty, how did you know?
Well, a woman could say she was married.
She could say that, but didn't mean anything.
Yeah.
What would make it mean something? What would happen in those relationships? The consummation was witnessed. The consummation was witnessed. Remember the story of Henry VIII with his divorces? Well, one of his marriages was to Anne of Cleves, and he really didn't have to divorce her. Why? Because the relationship was never consummated. Then you would have an annulment without any problem. Cool, so what does an annulment say as opposed to a divorce? What's the difference between an annulment and a divorce?
It's not.
Yeah, divorce says there's a separation. There was a marriage, and then annulment says there never was a marriage. Now that was true originally when you were talking about people who never consummated the marriage. You could say that legally. But then you had the Catholic Church who would grant annulments to people that they wanted to favor, saying, well, the marriage never really existed. But biblically, yeah, it did. Certainly in the Old Testament understanding and sense. So this woman is now unable to marry anybody else because of this. She is to him. course, later on, her full brother learns about it and murders his brother, which angers David, of course, but then later he forgives his son Absalom. But you see that becomes the understanding of that. And you see that especially now in Matthew 1, the story of Mary and Joseph. This is how the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married with Joseph, but before they came together, before there was a consummation, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to law, yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace. He had in mind to divorce her quietly. So, Joseph finds out Mary's pregnant. What does this mean? He can't touch her. He can't touch her. Now, she is, because of the fact that she is engaged in the culture was such that said that's almost tantamount to marriage. So what could he have had done to her? Stoned, or certainly disgraced. But being a good man, what does he do instead? He's going to end it quietly. Why? So that she is free to marry whoever got her pregnant. She doesn't have to face shame. And he would have gone about doing that, except what? He gets this dream, and an angel appears to him and says, hey, it's okay. Take her as your own wife. Even though their marriage was not consummated until after Jesus was born.
Why couldn't he have it annulled rather than divorce since it's
Because, well, culturally it had come to the point, you see that already in the time of the Torah, like here, was mentioned here. Virgin who is not pledged to be married. Now, the marriage hasn't been consummated, but if there was a pledge, then it would also be considered adultery, though not on necessarily the same level. So, but if there was no sexual relations, even if there was a pledge, even if you had a ceremony, that didn't matter. But with royalty, you would definitely witness the consummation. So, in the case of Solomon, the wives would know who their wife, if they really were his wife. They would be known not by what they said, but what the witnesses had said, because those things were witnessed. So, okay, Matthew 19 and divorce. Some Pharisees came to Jesus to test him. They asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? All right? And Jesus answers by going back to the beginning. Somebody read here.
Haven't you read? He replied that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning.
So when Jesus quotes from Genesis 2, what's the situation of mankind? What's the spiritual condition of mankind in Genesis 2? Genesis 3 has not taken place. What happens in Genesis 3? The temptation and fall. So this is what's in creation. This is what God set up for marriage. This is God's intent. Now the divorce thing comes later in the laws of Moses. What's happened to humanity since Genesis 2? The fall, sin. So you see God placing these rules and regulations, not to say deep down this is okay, but to limit the sin that's already there. So the purpose of the certificate of divorce was not to say divorce is okay, but to put a check on its influences, his problems. It's like when you have the law, what's called the lex talionis, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That's not saying that God's intent was for punishment, but it's saying that because of punishment, we are going to put guidelines on it. And so the whole point of eye for an eye is not to say do something cruel to somebody, but it's to put a check on punishment, that the punishment should fit the crime. You don't go one better than that. And that's the purpose. It's recognizing in the sinful world we have to put checks and balances on it. Another example is you don't seem to have a specific law against slavery in the Bible, and there's talk of slaves, but it's not saying that the Bible says slavery is okay. It's recognizing since it exists, here are some of the things that we will do to limit its effects. So that, for instance, laws about not mistreating slaves and having them as a part of the worship community. So just because they don't, in the Bible, forbid the slavery doesn't mean that they're saying it's good. It's just recognizing this is a part of the sinful world that we live in. All right. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. So Jesus is going back to the beginning and saying this is how serious it is. Now, one of the big things that he's doing, he's dealing with a situation in which women were being taken advantage of. There were various schools among the rabbis. Some had a very strict Old Testament type of understanding from the Ten Commandments that divorce is only something to do because you just have to. Lots of limits on it. But there were others who said, oh yeah, it's okay as long as you follow the laws. And so men were divorcing their wives, and divorcing their wives put them in the same situation as being widowed. But why were the men doing that? Why were men divorcing their wives? Well, it wouldn't have been for unfaithfulness, because what could a man do if his wife had committed adultery? He didn't have to bother divorcing her. If she was caught in an adulterous relationship, she could be stoned to death. He didn't have to worry about she wouldn't be his wife anymore. They were doing it for any trivial reason. Why were they doing it? Why would men seek to divorce their wives? Especially in relationships where you have several wives.
So you wouldn't have to support.
You wouldn't have to support her. She's getting older. She's contributing less to the family. Physically, because she's older, she's not as attractive. She's not producing children. I'd rather have a young wife who's going to produce children and provide more for me, but I can't afford this old one, so I'll divorce her. They're really misusing it. And that's what Jesus is speaking about. And he's saying one of the big problems is now you have these women who are divorced, and what are they forced to do? Look for ways to get married. And he's saying you're forcing them into sin, because for them to get remarried is what? Adultery. So, if we take Jesus at his word in the Old Testament too, how many marriages are adulterous, even apart from divorce? The biblical understanding would be if I have sexual relations with somebody, how is the only way that I can really have sexual relations with somebody else? What? If I have sexual relations with somebody else, the only way that I can have sexual relations with another person is for that person to die. So what does that say about sexual relationships before marriage? It's not so much the idea of having sex before marriage as it is having sex with a person different from your spouse. That's the huge thing. And that's, of course, the thing that we're dealing with in our world and our society, far bigger than the divorce issue. is the amount of people, sexual partners that people have, and then suppose they get married. Well, the first time they had sex with a second person, that's adulterous already. Acts 15 gives this specific concern to the early Christians. They're saying that you don't have to be a Jew to be a Christian, but they want them to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. Now, what do they mean by sexual immorality? Well, in the Gentile world, what was for a man his condition sexually prior to marriage? Were most pagan men virgins when they got married? No. It was encouraged that they have a lot of sexual partners and could have sowed their wild oats before they got married, which is very different than in the Jewish world, where in the Jewish world, if you had sexual relations with somebody and was found out, you were married. The extent of this adultery is seen in Galatians 5, where it's seen as one of the acts of the flesh. It's put in that category. And Matthew 5:27, it's given a much fuller understanding than by Jesus, who takes the commandments in the Sermon on the Mount and shows the full extent of them. You've heard it said you should not commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So what does that mean for us? When you think of pornography, which is the number one affliction in our culture, most of us, especially us men, have committed adultery. So what's the overall answer to all this as Christians? Confession and forgiveness. Confession and forgiveness. Because if we take it to its full extent, we've all committed adultery. But that forgiveness is great. And that forgiveness turns us to do, as we say in the sixth commandment, to lead a chaste and decent life. And what's the big purpose behind leading a chaste and decent life? It's more than obedience to government laws. It's a witness to the community, those kinds of things, that you're witnessing to the community of the difference it makes because God is in your life. Now, to look at this more fully, traditionally, adultery is wrong. There are laws still in many states against it. In the military, it is breaking military law to commit adultery. And yet, it's all over the place. Maybe in those times, it was not a problem. But look at it today. You see here the phenomenon that's taken place, especially in European countries, of living together before marriage. And you see, it's like in Scandinavia, the vast majority of people have children even before they get married. The United States is kind of halfway there, but countries like that, huge percentage of it. And of course, the United States, you see how it's increased. Now, they've done studies on it. Where are marriages happier? When you get married before have children, or when you wait later in life to get married and you have a chance, in a sense, to check things out? Well, it really doesn't matter that way as much as the other factors. The bigger factor is in the culture. Is there an emphasis on maintaining relationships and support that way, or isn't there? Because in the Scandinavian countries, you may have a lot of living together before marriage, but much lower divorce rates than you have in other countries. So there's sometimes a feeling, well, we should get married before we live together because it is better culturally and it has a better chance of our marriage being happy and successful. You might think that way, but statistics don't always bear that out. What's the reason for us to have this understanding of marriage and not check things out through living together? For us, the issue is not a practical issue, it's the moral issue of what God intended for marriage. And the idea of living together before you get married is there's a difference between whether you're doing that to test the waters and to see whether you're really going to marry this person, or saying we're just going to do it slowly, but this is my intended for the rest of my life. Because if you had the attitude of saying, I'm to test that out, I may go with someone else, well then that's adultery. You're putting yourself in an adulterous situation. But if the situation is, this is the person, but not necessarily going through the legal wedding, that's a different situation. Not saying that in and of itself is good, but it is a different attitude. Because biblically, the idea of common law marriage is biblical, fine, as long as this is the only person. So why get the marriage license? Why have the wedding? Well, we put it this way. Those are not sixth commandment issues. That's a fourth commandment issue. The reason you go through with the wedding and the license is not to avoid committing adultery, but to show that you respect the law, you respect your society, you respect people in it. You understand what I'm saying there? Because we have elevated the wedding to being what marriage is really all about, and the wedding is just something we've added. It's not a part of what originally was there. Far more important to God is the marriage than the wedding. And what have we done often culturally with the wedding? What's happened culturally to the wedding? You have a couple, they're ready to get married, but they're not going to get married for another 2 years. Why? The wedding. The wedding. Ask them, is there any other reason why you're not married? The wedding. What should be the case with that couple? That you married. Make it legal. Well, we make such a big deal. And sometimes, a lot of times, who's really putting the pressure on them to wait for the wedding? The parents. The parents. They have no problem with them living together and all that stuff, but they still want to wait for the big wedding. Instead of saying, yeah, get married. We can have a celebration later. Because that's not what the really important thing for God is. It's the marriage, not the wedding. And if I get a wedding and go through that, that's a fourth commandment issue, not a sixth commandment. Or if a couple has sexual relations, what is better for them? To get married or to wait for the wedding? St. Paul said it's better to get married than burn. Instead of saying, oh, now you got to hold back, it's not right. No, the way to make it right is to join together then as husband and wife, to live that way. So the big adultery problem in our culture isn't so much having sexual relationships prior to marriage, but having sexual relationships with various people. That's the big issue. 77% of Americans had sex by the age 20. 75 had premarital sex. Women born from 1949 to 78, 91% of them Women born between 1939 and 48, 82%. How much of this involved adultery? Well, and remember, this is heterosexual relations. Well, much of the time it wasn't, because this was the person they were going to marry. But there's still lots of times where this happened. And that's why it's something we need to bring up to our kids, is to not be sexually active until marriage. Because what are you doing to the marriage? You're making it adulterous. The answer to that, well, is to try to limit that, but the other, of course, is the confession forgiveness idea. Is it better to try out marriage beforehand? Well, the problem with that is what's happened to our culture. When you look at the Bible, how did most marriages take place and how were they done historically? How did marriage happen culturally? How did most marriages take place? They were arranged. When you arrange a marriage, how does that take away from adultery? Well, if the person's pledged, then you can't play the field yet. And it's protected, especially the woman is protected from that. So there isn't any of that kind of playing of the field. Secondly, who's making the arrangement? Who makes the arrangement? Mom and dad. And what's the difference between mom and dad deciding as opposed to me deciding? Who does a better job? Who does a better job historically? Mom and dad do. Because they're looking at the things that really matter. They're not looking about what's in, the kind of falling in love thing, which is not practical, not long-lasting. They're looking at that way. But also, when your marriage is arranged, what do you focus on? Finding the right person or making it work? Well, it's arranged. You have nothing to do with who it is. But you can do a lot to make it work. Well, guess what? If you choose who you're going to marry, what's the key to a happy marriage? Finding the right person or making it work? Making it work. Making it work. That's still what counts in a marriage. No matter if that's the perfect person, you still have to be able to forgive and to grow together. And that's why historically you didn't have that issue. But now in our culture where you decide who you're going to get married, it puts a lot of pressure on it because people will do things in ways that aren't good. And of course, too, what's happened with our cultural mobility and so forth, there's so many more opportunities for young people to be involved with this that you didn't have. And then another really big issue is what's happened to the marriage age in our culture today. It's gone up. So there's many, many more years of people having to refrain from being sexually active than you used to have, which makes it harder and harder and harder to do. And then, of course, the way we are bombarded with images and what's behind that bombardment of images to promote sexuality that way. What's really behind it all? Why is pornography such a big thing? Money. You make money off it. You want to sell your car? How do you sell your car? Do you talk about the mechanics of it? Well, if you're talking to somebody who's really into it, maybe you're getting him to buy it. But the typical man, how do you get him to buy the car? Well, because he sees the attractive woman in it and thinks I get her with it. That kind of thing. So you have all that promotion, and it makes it much, much harder. Plus, the opportunities that young people have to be with each other in ways that you didn't before. Those you can remember, what did it used to be like in a college dormitory for women? Were men in that dormitory? If they were, it was just in the foyer where there was a house mother there to supervise. Now what do you have? Well, there.
Every other floor might be guys, gals.
Well, no. There are some floors that are both male and female. And usually don't have male and female roommates per se, but you can have both male and female on the same floor. Yeah. And then with the apartment situation, you have people doing that. Now, I've known lots of people who they're just rooming with a person of the other sex. There's no relationship otherwise, it's just a matter of convenience. And of course, that wouldn't have been accepted years ago. And of course, people years ago didn't live in apartments. You lived with your parents. You didn't have the freedom to do those kinds of things like today. And also with the weddings, because you didn't have to wait so long for the wedding, like Paul said, you didn't have to burn. Better to marry, not burn. But does our faith make a difference? Well, yes. Sexual activity among active Christians. Not to be, if you just take the general Christian population, people say they're Christian. No, it's not the case. But among active Christians is less than the general population. Christian couples, like I said, will be more concerned about obedience to government laws and their witness to the community. So the idea of sharing housing before marriage, they're not going to do, not because they could say we're refraining from sexual relations till we get married, but they say, no, this is still not a good witness to the world. And so we're going to intentionally show that we're not going to do it so that everything is done in propriety as a positive witness to our faith. Even though they could do things that in themselves, there's nothing wrong with it. And then another thing that Christian couples will do is they'll make the decision then instead of waiting for the big wedding to say, okay, let's get married. I just did a celebration a week and a half ago for a couple that was planning to get married then, but talking about them last year, they said, yeah, we should get married. And so they just had a small ceremony with their parents. And that way they could do the legal things, join together, they got a house together, and then none of that junk was in the way, it was all over with, and they could still have their big celebration with their friends and family, but not have any of that pretending they hadn't done something. So, and it was helped by the fact that their parents then didn't put the pressure on, so, oh, no, you didn't wait till the wedding, but they said, no, good, that's a good thing to do. All right, questions, thoughts? You see how huge a problem it is, but it's so huge that the answer we really got is to put it in the whole area of confession and forgiveness and realize, boy, there's so much sin in the area, and we need to confess it, and then in our regeneration to live out what we can. Not saying that people who have been sexually active before marriage should then end that marriage because it's adulterous, no, but to live it in a faithful life and to really convey to their children the importance of waiting till it's permanent, till marriage for it. Because otherwise they're forcing themselves or others into it. For instance, if I've been sexually active before my marriage to other people and they're still alive, what am I doing to my wife or the person that's going to be my wife? I'm forcing her into an adulterous relationship. One way to convey this in confirmation class is to take an overripe banana, pass it around, and ask every one of the children or the youth to do something to make it a little messier, stomp on it or whatever. And then after you're all done, ask, would you want to eat this? You know, God wants marriage to be best for us. And that's why he says one person. So you don't have all this other garbage in the way. Okay, comments, questions? That's all it would become. Forget it, forget it. Forget it, yeah.
It's just
Like, in the area of homosexuality,
kind of sins as well.
homosexuality, for instance, is a place where traditionally Christians would point the finger at blame because they say, wow, you know, that's something that's repulsive to me, much less not temptation. So I can really point out and say how bad that is. Because it's not going to point at me at all. But then when you look at what Christ says about lust in your mind, whoa, that points to me. I mean, that's not something we could put on a pedestal. We're all that way. It's sort of like lying, you know. Those are the types of things we're all tempted by. So if we're going to point out homosexuality, then we got to be willing to point out the truth about heterosexual relationships and what God feels about that. So all coming with the attitude, we need forgiveness. Yeah. Next week, we're going to look at the issue of poverty. Okay, can we pray? Dear God, we thank you for the wonderful gift of marriage, and we thank you for how you blessed us with us, and we ask that you help us and our children, grandchildren, to convey that positive attitude to this world where it's often manipulated and used for selfish reasons. We pray this in your name. Amen. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.